36 states of the Federation, 37 ministers, including the FCT, as enshrined in the Constitution. The President is mindful of this, but says that not all ministers will be handed portfolios. If he goes through with this, it will be the first time the Constitution will come under intense scrutiny, at least for Chapter 6, Section 148. What implication does this have on the country? My guest, Professor Fidelis Odita, spoke to me on this. Professor Fidelis Odita, we want to thank you so much indeed for coming on State of the Nation. You've been watching the political scenario lately and have seen what Mr. President has said about Nigeria. As a matter of fact, he said that Nigeria is broke. That's on the one hand. On the second hand, we have the ministers, and some of them will have to make do with our portfolio. That's according to him. What do you make of this statement? How potent is this statement to the governance of a country as big as Nigeria?
I think there are many errors with the whole ministerial thing. First of all, there's an error in the Constitution which requires a ministerial nominee from each state, and then insists that those people must be indigenes of those states. I don't see why, if you're a president and you feel you need 15 or 18 ministers to work with, why you should be constrained by the Constitution from working with 15 or 18, or why you should be required to work with 36 and to bloat your government unnecessarily, not for the purpose of achieving any efficiency or indeed any economies, but in order to pander to ethnic influences. So we got that wrong in the first place. And having started on the wrong footing that you need 36 people from each state, which of course is also partly a problem of state creation, and there are also clamors for additional states. Maybe if they were to create 14 additional states, following the provision in section 147 subsection 3 of the Constitution, you will now have 50 ministers. It doesn't make sense. You don't need rocket science to know that there is something fundamentally deficient with that approach. Having said that, in most countries of the world, appointments or nominations to ministerial positions are usually labeled. If you go, for example, to the UK example, you have the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so someone is nominated as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Someone is nominated as a Secretary of State for Home Affairs. Someone is nominated. You don't just have a list of nominees to be approved, although the UK is perhaps not a good example. Perhaps the American system, which is a presidential system, is closer. It's unusual for you to have a nominee sent to the Senate for confirmation when you don't know what that nominee is supposed to do. So we've got our own totally wrong. And I think in our case, the problem started in 1999 with President Obasanjo. He was wrong to have sent those lists. The Senate should have asked him to attach labels to attach designations or offices or portfolios to those names so that they would know how to screen them. How do you know whether, for example, a person is suitable as a minister for defense if you do not know what he's been nominated for? So you have a blanket approval or confirmation process for everyone, as if you're looking at their eligibility or suitability as individuals.
Do you subscribe to the Supreme Court, for example, coming in to wade into the situation that we have for Mr. President against the Constitution?
If the Supreme Court were to take the view, it will be based on interpretation. I have heard arguments to the contrary in the past, even on channels. I've seen some of your guests argue that there is no requirement to have a minister from each state, and that the way you get to that is to ask whether the Constitution requires the president to create any particular number of ministries. And once you've answered the question that the Constitution does not require you to create a particular number of ministries, it follows inexorably from that premise that you don't need to have 36 ministers. You just have ministers to attach to the ministries that you have created. That is a viewpoint. That is one possible way that the Supreme Court could assist, by saying, as a matter of interpretation, you are not required to have 36 ministers from each of the 36 states. But that is not because the Supreme Court is ignoring the Constitution. Indeed, the Supreme Court is not at liberty to ignore the Constitution. The Supreme Court is merely interpreting the Constitution.
When the president says that Nigeria is broke, is that a guided statement?
If you are dependent on a single commodity, as we are on oil, and the oil price has fallen by more than 90%, you don't need rocket science to know that you're in trouble.
Where then lies the biggest concerns for Nigeria today?
Yesterday, the Senate president created 67 or 65 committees. Those are wasteful committees, mostly. I saw all sorts of things listed there. And people are not complaining about the misapplication or misuse of our Commonwealth in those type of ventures. Why should the number of ministers per se be such a concern? How much does it cost to keep a minister? The real problem is the civil service, isn't it? Because if you want to have ministries supporting each minister, then you have created a very expensive bureaucracy. That's where the problem is. I don't think it's in the payment of emoluments of ministers. If, for example, you took out 9 ministers and you asked yourself, what is the salary of a minister? I don't know off the top of my head, but I'll be surprised if there was any minister whose salary is up to 2 million naira a month. So that is not the problem. And people talk about their wages, but there's nothing in their wages. What about those ministers are going to have special assistants? Their special assistants are going to have personal assistants. And they're going to have all these cars and perks of office and so on. Those obviously are wasteful and need to be contained somehow. But by far, the biggest problem is the over-bloated public service. It appears that as a nation, we exist just to pay salaries to some of our fellow Nigerians.
So what we need right now actually is a change in mindset.
We need more than a change of mindset. We need to reform public service. I don't see how you can advance any society. I mean, a society like Nigeria without significant reform of the public service. You do need that. I actually would like to see the professionalization of the public service, but unfortunately, like most of those things, it will require downsizing the public service. The public service needs to be downsized so that it's lean, mean, and efficient.
When you talk about trimming down the workforce in Nigeria, that's the public workforce, perhaps there are ghost workers and we wouldn't have to do that. All you need to do is to find out who the ghost workers are.
Well, both ghosts and real workers. There's a problem of ghost workers, but even the real workers are too many. There are just too many people doing too little. If you run a business yourself, why would you, for example, have 10 messengers if one will do? Why would you have 10 typists if one will do? Why do many people need typists anyway in this day and age when most people can type for themselves? But if you advance those arguments, people will say you are trying to render the stenographers and the secretaries jobless. But that's not the point. You've got to see what works for the nation.
Are you satisfied with the appointed ministers so far?
I must say I don't know them personally. I watched some of the proceedings in the Senate. Among the politicians, at least some of those we know, like Fashola, Fayemi, and the rest, some of them look okay. The so-called technocrats, I know very little of them, but from what I saw during some of the interviews, they seem okay. If they're allowed to work, there are two things. It's one thing to appoint the right people. It's another thing to allow them to do the work for which you've appointed them. I did not see a lot that was wrong with some of the nominees that worked with Jonathan, but he did not allow them to work in manners which are corrupt-free. And so when you're working in that type of environment, no matter how able you are, you can't perform efficiently because the system does not want you to work properly. If I say to you, please don't remind me about my work, just allow me to pretend that I'm busy whereas I'm doing nothing, no matter how good you are as a timekeeper, you won't tell me anything because I've already instructed you not to disturb me. And people accept appointment on those terms. And that's because most of them lobby for the appointment. How do you lobby for something and now start laying ground rules? If you were on your own and someone came to tap you and say, would you like to be a minister? You might then tell them, I'd like to be a minister on these and these and these terms. But many of these nominees are not in a position to say the terms on which they are prepared to serve. It's not to be arrogant, but it's to say, look, I'm happy to serve my country if I'll be allowed to do so. If I'll be allowed to exercise the powers and responsibilities which are attached to this ministry. The vast majority of them do not have that courage because they have lobbied and they are pandering to the people who put them there. And so no matter how good they are, they simply lack independence, which they need to be able to perform satisfactorily. Having said that, I have seen nothing in this crop of nominees to suggest that they will not do well. If anything, as Dr. Kachiku said during his own confirmation hearing, he says he's working, if he has a problem, it will be himself, unlike in the past, where it is the president stopping you from doing your work. So this president wants him to do his work, and so if he fails, we as Nigerians should judge him on his own failure and won't allow him to take refuge in presidential interference.
How would the signing of portfolios to the ministers affect the present situation if they had been given portfolios before now?
There are several aspects to this question. The president himself has said that some ministers will be without portfolio. I suspect that what he has in mind is that they will have no specific ministry assigned to them. But the Constitution does not require the allocation of specific ministries to ministers. All that the Constitution says in Section 148 is that the president may assign responsibilities to the vice president and the ministers. So long as he assigns responsibilities to all his ministers, he doesn't need to allocate any particular ministry to a minister. And he doesn't need to allocate ministries to all the ministers. So to that extent, I think it's a storm in a teacup to say he won't assign portfolios to them. He has a duty to assign responsibilities to all his ministers. And by law, they are part of his cabinet. He cannot change them. Well, I think as a nation, we have been saying we're a great nation. We have very many able people. But as a nation, we have not done enough to position ourselves for prosperity. And we need to do a lot more than that.
Professor Fidelis Odita, I want to thank you so much indeed for coming on State of the Nation. We do appreciate your time and your thoughts.
My pleasure.
Interesting views from the senior advocate of Nigeria. Well, all this starts well, ends well. We will be watching, though, on how this unfolds. In the meantime, Boko Haram seems silent for about a week now. Is the war on terror finally been won, giving way for peace? The discussion continues online. Let's tweet. This is State of the Nation. Bye for now.